It's going to be a good show. Stay tuned for the insanity going on in Little League. Needless to say, every day, the left, the radical left that wants to destroy this country, pushes more and more to indoctrinate our children. And now we see institutions such as Little League that should be the purest thing ever for kids just playing ball is now being used to indoctrinate kids. Really sad.
Fantastically said. Thank you so much. So give us a little bit of an introduction to the people who might not know who Sarah is.
Okay, yeah. Our guest today is going to be Sarah Collier. She's a good friend of mine who I regularly do videos with. She has a YouTube channel, which the link can be found in the description. She discusses politics, discusses kind of the things that are going on with the radical left trying to destroy the country. And she's an immigrant who came from the UK and has a very unique take. I think who's one of the best YouTube personalities I've seen talking about this. So thank you so much for being here today, Sarah. And we're really honored to have you on Pennsylvania Patriot Radio.
Thank you for having me. I do appreciate it.
So I would like to welcome Sarah. It's Carlos Saldivia from Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And along with me is Todd Bartley, also from Williamsport. Today, he's a world traveler, so you never know where he's going to be. But one of the things that you and I share is that we were both born outside of this country, but few like us have the discernment and understanding and the love for this country, and that immigrants do. I'm not saying that all immigrants don't, but we're vocal about it and make no bones about it. So I guess my first question in trying to understand the leadership and what the leadership in this country is doing with respect to pushing back to what's happening. My very first question is, how did you and I not become victim?
Well, firstly, I just want to go ahead and say that I think it's sad that so few immigrants are grateful for what we have here in the United States. It ought to be the de facto kind of nature of things that if you leave another country and you come here to the United States, that you appreciate the uniqueness of it, that you appreciate whatever it is here that you came to that was better than where you fled. And so often is the case that isn't so, that immigrants want to vote for the very thing that they fled. And that's something that I've found continually problematic.
Todd?
Sarah, I'd really, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time and having seen some of the shows that you and Rob have done. If folks are not already checking that out, you are missing educational hours of your life that you will never get back. It is worth the watch. It is worth the listen. So there is a shameless plug for you guys and the work that you're doing. With that said, you currently reside in the state of North Carolina. We're seeing a lot of measures here in Pennsylvania with universal masking and Secretary of Health Levine putting executive orders out with the governor. You're seeing similar things in North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, even though, and I graduated high school, in North Carolina. Some of my classmates are doing graph work every day on case counts and death rate and those types of things. If I'm not mistaken, North Carolina, even though they're seeing a surge, the fatality rate and the mortality rate is still quite low.
Yeah, that's certainly true. The mortality rate is low, but the thing is that we don't really know, and this is one of the problems nationwide that we've had is, do we know how many people are dying of this condition, of this virus? I don't think that we do. I mean, if you look at the official CDC guidelines to hospitals, it literally said that if somebody dies of a heart attack or what have you with the virus, count that as a virus death. And if that's the case, then that kind of puts all of the numbers into speculation. I mean, if you were to count, say, flu, deaths that way, then the flu deaths that you have would be exponentially higher than they are each year. And as such, we can't learn anything from this. It's like they're building up a lie so they can take people's rights away. And by the way, I'm not saying that there isn't a virus that exists, but I'm saying that they are inflating numbers and telling lies in order to provide an excuse under which they can basically do whatever they want. Because if you look at these executive orders, that's not the way America's supposed to work. With a governor essentially making laws by fiat in some areas of the country, choosing what the penalties will be for violating an executive order. An executive order was just supposed to be so that a governor could tell his agencies how to handle one thing or another, not to impose laws on the citizens and then impose penalties on those citizens and then tell its own court system how to deal with those citizens. It's honestly tyrannical, and I'm really sad to say that there isn't more resistance going up to this.
Sarah, this is Rob. Thank you again for being here. So one of the things we talked about recently that I think that our audience would really like to hear your input on, we're going to be talking here a little bit later about the situation in Williamsport with Little League. And I have this theory that they're going after all these institutions that are pure and have kind of the moral backbone of the United States. Can you talk a little about, while we're on COVID, one of the first areas that seemed to be attacked with a lot of these executive orders was people's right to go to church, or how once people were in church, there's certain things they couldn't do. And kind of if that underpins kind of a greater philosophical thought from these authoritarians on the left and how they want to control us?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's kind of telling that Christians were among the first to be, I guess, attacked. You had governors who didn't pause any on the topic of religious freedom. They didn't slow down before saying, you know what, I have the authority, the grand authority to tell you whether or not you can worship, how you can worship, to come up with arbitrary fines for even if you try to comply, like we had over in, I think it was Mississippi, where they tried to do the whole drive-in theater style worship. They were trying to comply, and that's a word we've seen tossed around a lot, this word comply. But I never really heard that much in American politics beforehand. But in any case, you had these people who were trying to worship in a way that complied with the governor's request and the mayor's request, and I think it was the mayor in this case, who sent police out there to give arbitrary fines, $500 a person. So if you a car, two people, $1,000 right there for the audacity to worship. And again, it's a problem of not enough people being willing to speak up because they're afraid, because we have this kind of collective shaming of anyone who dares to speak about rights at this time. You hear people say, well, it doesn't matter about your rights, there's a virus. It's like, if your rights don't matter now, if your rights don't matter, if the government can just say, you know what, it's an emergency, your rights don't matter, then you don't have any rights. You only have rights if they really are immutable, if the government can't take them away. That's what a right is, as opposed to a privilege.
And moreover, my thesis, when you link it up to Robert's thesis, is conservatives never fight. Why is that?
Well, I think part of the problem, and this has been going on, it seems to me, for decades in Republican politics, is that you have those on the left, you call them Democrats, but, left and even far left, who make emotional arguments. And emotional arguments sound like moral arguments, even when they're not. Don't you care about these poor people? Then why do you oppose welfare programs? And then you have those people who are on the right, the Republicans, who have this habit of going on the defensive, but then talking about money, like going on some kind of, well, it's kind of off topic almost, but they so rarely make the moral argument. And conservatives have a moral argument to make about how welfare undermines those very poor communities. And so few seem to have, really grasped this. And so that's part of the problem, that as a argument, Republicans have been losing it. They've been losing the culture war for decades and kind of ignoring it and acting like we can just talk numbers all day, when really the moral arguments matter, and we need to stop acting like we don't have the moral argument, because we most certainly do.
Who in our country would you point to as being a strong conservative leader or leaders?
They're few and far between. I mean, honestly, I think that's a big part of the problem, is that especially when you look at, okay, just take like the national leadership for a minute of conservatives. And I mean this in the sense of the political sphere, you know, like Ted Cruz and so on, but also in the area of pundits. So many people are afraid to speak now, and that's also part of our problem. Like if you've got conservatives who are afraid to say what they really think, are afraid to be, for example, anti-immigrant, you know, to the degree that they really feel. Let's just say that that's their opinion. Then how can we possibly win in the future? If even conservatives who are elected to speak or who are acting as pundits, and thus it's their job to represent some people, to even represent an idea, one might say, won't speak out, then we're going to essentially, in a very gradual way, lose kind of the argument. And it's like you look at, for example, CPAC. I think that represents a really good example of the problem, because this is the conservative kind of get-together that happens regularly or once a year, as many people know. Well, you look at their most recent conference. You know who they had there? The recent guy who was arrested, the Antifa guy who was just arrested over in Seattle for his essentially rioting and organizing riots. He was allowed in CPAC because it was really important for the conservatives to act like, well, we welcome opposing voices. But who wasn't? Well, there was no Milo, there was no, like, you know, Gavin McInnes, there was no, even the InfoWars news crew. You know, I'm not even a fan of some of these people, but, you know, you're going to appeal to those on the left, the people who have ties to Antifa, who now are facing riot charges, but not anybody else because you don't like their opinion on the right. It's insane. And that's what we are. Why are we more afraid of conservatives who speak out than we are, you know, like those on the left can say anything they want, as far left as they want. They can say, bring on the communist utopia, and we're like, come on into CPAC. But, you know, you've got somebody else and on the right, and we're like, no, stay away. You make me feel bad or sound bad or what have you. I don't want to be associated with you.
Well, the reason is it's a very simple answer, Sarah. It's they are not who they say they are. But in that thread, our show is completely based on the idea that we're trying to give tools to people to stand on their own 2 feet and understand the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the founding papers. And so let's just take a microcosm of 4 opinions: yours, Todd's, mine, and Robert's. And if we were going to build a pushback of 4 core reasons as to why we should push back and lead and give and set examples for other people, here is the one that I would start with respect to just statues that are Confederates and why we name Confederates to military bases. Okay? The Civil War was fought between Americans. So to heal that war and to end the war and have as fast as possible some sort of healing, they put up statues of both Confederates and Union soldiers everywhere as an act of healing back then in the mid-1800s. That's why those statues exist. So that's one idea of pushing back and showing leadership as to why these statues should never come down. It was an act of healing. What would yours be, Sarah?
Mine would be that history matters, and the people who want to get rid of these statues aren't doing it so much because they don't like this individual snippet of history. It's because they don't like history in general. If you look at communists, and ultimately that's who we're really fighting against, if you listen to their rhetoric enough, communists always hate history. They always try and destroy history and destroy our essentially remembrance of it. They don't want us to learn the mistakes from it. And frankly, that's important if you're a communist and your entire history of every instance of your ideology being put forth failed in an epic way with, millions of deaths. It would be pretty important for you to cover up history to prevent people from learning anything from it. Fantastic. And also, if you were trying to essentially indoctrinate the youth in the colleges, which, happens, you want to essentially destroy their history so that you can rewrite it exactly how you want to rewrite it, so that you can change the way essentially their whole perspective of where we live and why changes.
And
essentially creating a false history.
Right.
Exactly.
And on that note, I don't think that it's any surprise that you're absolutely right. For example, if you look up Cambodia and Pol Pot, he had what was called Year Zero, where he destroyed history before him, destroyed all of these statues, destroyed all of the culture that was occurred before him, because he was, the great savior. And what did that result in? Hundreds of thousands of death, pyramids of skulls. And also you see the exact tactics that are now being embraced, this pulling down of the statues. Every time I talk to someone on the left, they say, who cares about statues? But do you think it's a coincidence that this is the exact same tactic that you see ISIS use and other terrorist organizations? Because they understand the symbolism, like you're saying, of destroying a country's history and destroying people's pride in a country. That's a prerequisite to then instituting your own philosophy and your own power movement to be able to wipe out a country and the people's support of it.
Yeah,
Yes.
I agree. I think there is something really symbolic about we're going to have to take down every statue that represents the history of America, because America's history is just so incredibly negative that we have to erase it, essentially. And that's what they're saying. That, America must be erased, must be torn down and rebuilt as that communist dystopia, is what I'm going to call it.
Good.
Good.
Todd, what is your one single core idea to show leadership in these times?
So let me talk about flags and symbols just for a moment. May I?
Sure.
So the cancel culture wants everyone to take down the Confederate flag, which was carried, by the way, into battle for the Confederacy to show troops where they were going to go fighting fellow Americans. Let's keep that part of the story in perspective. The behind the scenes meaning and what it means to certain people and how it offends them, I totally get it. Completely get it. Are we now canceling the Dukes of Hazzard? Because for me, that show and Uncle Jesse and the family values that it represented never one time spoke racism toward me. I never saw that. I never got that out of that show. It was a fast car with two brothers that were jumping all over the place with that car, going really, really fast. And then you had the law enforcement component where you had the lovable idiot, who likes the beautiful girl. And, they have this innocent relationship. I mean, it's all things wholesome, right, in America. And now we're trying to cancel it. Well, let me ask you a question, everybody. We're supposed to take down the Confederate flag. We're supposed to take down the United States flag, stars and bars, right? We're supposed to take down statues, as Carlos was saying, and as Rob has alluded to. So my question for Sarah is, at what point, once all these symbols and monuments and everything else come down, what flag or symbol goes up in its place? And let me posit it by saying, we're seeing racism has no home here in Williamsport and Lycoming County signs pop up like dandelions, everybody, because everybody wants to be woke right now. Is that the sign that's going to replace, or the flag that's going to replace everything else?
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it was the hammer and sickle that got raised, frankly, at this point. But, I mean, what they're trying to do is, if they're erasing essentially what I'm going to call the collective history of America, right? And then you look at what they're raising instead, sort of. You've got Black Lives Matter areas. You have Black Lives Matter being imprinted on roadways and so on. You also have, just suddenly popping up, you have the kind of gay rainbow being painted all over the place. Now, what's interesting is that these things that are replacing essentially the flags that you talked about aren't symbols of a collective America. They're symbols of a very specific group, each and individually. The groups at which they like to divide us, the groups at which these cultural Marxists are really seeking that separation. That's interesting because that's what they're seeking right now. They're seeking destruction based upon these group characteristics that they're trying to turn each other, against one another to maximally divide so they can essentially break down our entire civilization, as it were, and long term, presumably, then build the nation back up in their image. But right now, they're just seeking destruction, and to do that maximally by getting people to identify not as Americans with a shared history and a shared culture and a shared values and, a shared system of rights, but instead as, identify as I'm Black and therefore I'm separate from all of you, and so on. That's what they're trying to do.
Sarah, if I can do a follow-up real quick on that very idea. Is there any other country on the face of the earth where this can happen and there's not capital punishment in response from the government that they're doing this to?
Oh, you mean is there any nation on earth where you could essentially be treasonous and seditious? I don't think so. I don't think so. It's amazing what they've gotten away with, frankly, especially with their autonomous zones and so on. We're our own country. I mean, plenty of people would call that treason.
My favorite Facebook meme this week, Sarah, was a woman who posted, "Our country is so great that even our enemies don't want to leave." So
yeah, exactly.
You know.
And people are still coming, you know? And those on the left say we should accept everybody who comes, everyone who shows up at the borders. And it's like, well, if our country is so bad, then shouldn't we build a wall and keep them out, protect them, you know,
exactly.
from our evil?
So we have you, so I feel selfish, and I want to get to a lot of things. The first thing that came to your mind the second you heard that Little League International gave a full-throated support for a Marxist organization and then doubled down by changing their logo to basically appease this organization. Your first thoughts when you heard that?
That no area is sacred. That essentially these people who are behind this movement, if you can call it that, want you to think about it constantly, want you to have no area in which you can have peace, no area in which you can associate with your family and your kids away from this politics. That's what sports was supposed to be. I mean, you know, I'm a girl, I'm not that into sports, but really from every guy I've spoken to, it was like, sports is the area away from the real world. It's the escape, you know, and now, no, you can't do that. And that, you're talking Little League, you're talking, you know, kids. And even then, that they want to support the destruction of society, because that's basically what you're talking about with Black Lives Matter, because they, wherever they go, wherever they show up, they're destroying things, they're not building things, right? And so if you have this kind of really wholesome organization, you know, historically speaking, that's now supporting this destruction, it's like, well, nothing is free and sacred, nothing, you know, there is nothing that they won't touch.
And I think you see this, one of the things that's given me some optimism here recently was Trump's Mount Rushmore speech and him continuing to speak. Now, words are cheap. They need to take action. But about his recognition that the indoctrination of children in the education system is one of the big pillars that's allowing this to occur. So we can talk more about that in a second. But on the point you just made, I think that's such a smart point that they don't want one area of life where this isn't thrown in your face. And it's kind of like they want to inflict this traumatic stress on people where they want to attack you every moment of every day and say, you're evil, your country's evil, the way you were born is evil. And so that eventually you just raise your hands up and say, fine, I capitulate. I'm sorry. What do I have to do to stop this? What do I have to do to just have a moment of peace? I think you see this also with a bunch of the videos online when it comes to people wearing masks and things like that. Someone has to get in your face with a camera and accuse you. What are you doing? What are you doing? You can't go to the store without this being in your face. You can't watch a late night comedy show without this being thrown in your face. And I think that this is an intentional effort to be a full court press to demoralize people into thinking, well, if every area of society says that I'm wrong, if every area of society says that my beliefs and the way I look and the people I support are evil, well, there must be some truth to it. And I think that, what do you think is a way that, I think you kind of hit on it earlier, that we need to start pushing back and stop making these numbers just about, or arguments just about numbers, but start pushing back morally and saying, no, this isn't true. We don't want politics in many areas of life. And as I heard you put best, and I stole this line from you, the only reason they're able to do this is because they're comparing America to utopia. If you look at it contextually with other countries, America is the greatest country in the history of the world. So I think we need to stop listening to them demonize us totally and start pushing back.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that is the main problem with why we are where we are, is because so many conservatives or claimed conservatives, you know, have been staying quiet, are unwilling to really speak up. And that has to change, Rob, in order for us to change our collective society. If we're acting like we're, afraid that, of some leftist argument, it's ridiculous. We need conservative voices who speak up for what's right. I don't know why that's so difficult now. If conservatives believe what they say that they believe about America's fundamental, basis, about the importance of our rights and so on, then we certainly ought to have the moral high ground. America is incredibly unique for that recognition of our individual rights, not the collective, not the masses, but our individual rights granted by God. And if conservatives believe that, they certainly have a moral high ground. And if I might just, to respond to you briefly there, Rob, when you were mentioning how they won't give us any peace. I think it's interesting that it coincides with that brainwashing technique, right? Where the person doesn't get any eating, can't eat, can't sleep, can't get any peace, just gets the same message, thrown at them over and over and over again. And that's basically what you're seeing them do now.
So one of the things that I wanted to bring your attention to is the graphic that I posted here that I'm sharing on the screen. And if you see my cursor, I'll start with Steve Keener, the president's quote, "Kids aren't born to hate," Keener said. "They learn that from their environment, the parents, from the people they are around." Little League can play a role in encouraging parents, coaches, and others to start conversations with kids when they are young about inclusiveness and that it is unacceptable to hate somebody. Since when? Before just this week, when they decided to endorse this organization, did Little League ever say that that was acceptable? Since when? And your comments on how Little League doubled down and changed the logo of Little League to basically facilitate or to pander to this movement. Your thoughts, Sarah?
Well, it's like they're getting them while they're young. Essentially, joining in,
right.
Exactly, joining in the group on there is no too young before we can start acclimating them to, to this kind of, frankly, garbage, right? But you're right. It's like, they're talking about inclusiveness. What's more inclusive than a kid recognizing himself only as an American, playing with whoever happens to be in his neighborhood? There's never been let's play Little League and separate based upon race, and let's hate the other team, because they're some other race. That was never Little League, So it's like, therefore, they're just virtue signaling and acting like they once were something that they weren't. They've never been an organization of hate. They've never told kids to hate other Americans on the basis of some, characteristic. The idea is frankly absurd to everybody. And yet here they are acting like that's just kind of the way America is.
So I wrote a piece pushing back against the chairman and the president of Little League International. And listen, Sarah, I'm just a guy. I'm just a regular guy from down West 4th Street here in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Just a regular guy. I'm not an elected official. I wouldn't consider myself a leader in any silo that you might want to consider that includes the public sphere at all. I am the only person in the city of Williamsport to renounce the president of Little League International. What would you say to the leaders of a small community like ours? We're barely 27,000 people in the middle of the woods with a great brand that just has been thrown in the toilet by a guy that grew up in our area. The very last thing that we ever expected on this man's watch was for him to be on his knees. What would you say, based on your experience of America, to the people of Williamsport with respect to standing up for themselves? What would be your personal words?
Well, they certainly have to stand up because ultimately, that's why some people get on their knees. It's because they're afraid of people standing up. It's because some voices are louder, and some people don't have the courage enough to stand up for their own convictions, on the strength of those convictions. And I'll tell you, Carlos, if they don't have the strength of character enough, then they need to be shamed by the community. That community needs to say, stand up for what is right.
Yep.
And I've heard you and Rob talk about this ad nauseum. And this is what bothers me most. This is what scares me most, is and my thought process is always, think of the future. Think of the future. Be prepared for the future. What happens when the gag reflex of not being able to be shamed anymore occurs? What happens then?
That's a good question.
When you're literally unshameable. You understand?
Yes, but I think that a lot of people can be replaced. And around the time when people do start standing up is when they start standing in positions to replace those at the moment who don't have the courage to stand themselves. And that's what really needs to happen, especially in the area of elected representatives. I know this isn't, Little League, but in the area of elected representatives, well, that's what we basically need, is a groundswell of support of people who say, you know what, if you won't stand for the convictions that you said you held, then I will stand for them, and I will truly represent, the good people of America.
Which is what we're doing here with Rob and Todd. So yesterday, the President of the United States pushed back and basically, what was the word, Rob, with respect to Roger Stone? That he wasn't pardoned, but he was
commuted. His sentence was commuted. Yeah.
Your thoughts on that, Sarah? And is that not a pushback? And the president saying that, oh, I understand. I now will use the tools that you use to lead, and if everything is fair play, then this is fair play. And if you could talk a little bit about what was unsettled about how they prosecuted Stone in your mind, and your thoughts on the
commutation,
the commuting of the sentence. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, firstly, yes, it is President Trump standing up, essentially, and I'm glad to see it. I was really worried that he was going to let Roger Stone essentially go under the bus, so to speak. And I know that he was, it seemed like he was waiting until preferably after the election so he could pardon Roger, because it would, he didn't want to essentially have the collective uprising of the left and then screaming injustice or what have you, when in reality it was Roger's case that was an injustice. I don't think he should have been prosecuted in the first place, because the entire prosecution was based upon that Russia witch hunt, right? If it weren't for that, none of this would have even happened.
Exactly.
And then he got the Obama judge who was very clearly against him, and in so many of their statements, by the judge, it was clear that there was a bias. I mean, really painfully clear, and yet there was no other judge placed. The judge actually refused to recuse, and so basically Trump had to step in order to ensure justice, and so I'm glad that he did.
Right, and very much like the Sullivan case, the Judge Sullivan in the Flynn case. It didn't get any play with some of her atrocious comments in the courtroom. Biased comments.
Right.
So
Todd, did you have a point? Oh, sorry.
The question I have. Go ahead, Todd.
I just wanted to say, Rob, to your point, and get a response from Sarah just briefly. Sarah, did it surprise you that when Roger Stone was taken into custody, they sent more law enforcement and or military people and camera crew than they sent to Seattle when Chop and Chaz was founded? I'm just curious for your reaction. It said something, didn't it? I mean, about the whole prosecution. After that, who could take it seriously when it's like you're arresting this guy, supposedly for giving false information, right? For anybody who doesn't know, that was allegedly what this was all about, that he gave false information because he misremembered something. Okay,
for that, they showed up with rifles and SWAT gear and everything else. But CNN was there an hour before because supposedly, and we're all supposed to believe this, someone had a hunch at CNN that just maybe the big raid was going to take place at that time, just maybe in the middle of the night on that particular evening.
And moreover, Sarah, as you understand it, how does the FBI get a federal judge to give a no-knock warrant? How does that happen?
I think it's audacious that they were able to do so. And to do so, again, the entire case was based upon an inquiry, that was all about this whole Russia witch hunt based upon a dossier that was completely fabricated and so on. There is so much of this case that is grounded at the most fundamental level in lies, in stuff actually literally made up. And yet it's Roger that was supposedly on the stand, not the people that were trying to obstruct justice by making up these dossiers, by, giving them to the judges in this case, the FISA court and so on. It's incredible. And you can't obstruct justice in a fake case, I would say. And that's basically what they were accusing him of.
And I think that we're seeing a pattern, right? Like
Right.
the left and the Democratic Party is instituting the exact same playbook over and over and over against Trump. And that is this. They've accused Trump of being a dictator. Trump is the least dictatorial president ever. And you know how I know? Because he suffered a 4-year corrupt investigation into him and let it play out over and over and over. And so in every instance, what they're doing is they abuse their power under governor of law in order to, they abuse their power over and over in order to then try to force Trump to do a reaction that they could say, aha, Trump is abusing his power. So, for example, we see the mayor of Seattle allowed terrorist insurrectionists to overthrow part of her country because she was attempting to goad Trump into doing something. De Blasio allowed terrorists to burn down New York City or burn down parts of New York City because they wanted Trump to have to send in the National Guard so they could scream dictator. It's the exact same with Amy Berman Jackson, the judge in this case with Roger Stone, and what the FBI did to Stone, and what they did to Flynn, and what they did to Papadopoulos. They continue to abuse in ways that are hardly imaginable. In fact, I would call it the biggest political scandal in the history of this country. Obama's weaponizing these intel agencies to go after his political opponent. And then when Trump finally says enough is enough and pushes back, they say, aha, see, he is the dictator that we always knew. This is about setting the precedent where they're allowed to be on offense 24/7 and abuse these systems that make up the backbone of our country. And then when someone stands up and says, no, this is unacceptable, we're going to start using our power, such as executive power, to push back on this, they could say, no, that's unacceptable. That's the pattern I see.
Sarah?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, frankly. That is the pattern. And what is sad is just, it shows how bad our media is for anybody who didn't know, because the media is going along with it. They're going along with it like they are one of these, corrupt Obama-led agencies, interestingly enough. But really, I mean, they're still going with it as if Trump is the bad guy for commuting Roger Stone's sentence. And if the press were acting like a press is supposed to, a free press is supposed to, being that check on government corruption, which again is what a free press was supposed to do, then they should be the ones who are heralding this as finally, someone stepped in to end this corrupt sham of a case.
Well, and that's why we're in the place that we're in right now in this country, is because of the media. No, you ask anybody and you poll anybody, and they tell you that the people that they blame the most is the media, which leads me to my next question. And I would like Todd to be able to chime in on this because it's a media question. But Sarah, do you see an attempt by the left and its surrogates to manipulate the people of the United States via the early polling that's being done in the presidential race? I am not a subscriber of attacking Joe Biden based on the fact that he's not completely there. I think that it's a bad strategy. It's a bad tactic. And the reason is because if you make fun of Joe Biden and the way that he is, due to no fault of his own, this is not something that Joe wants to do. This is just the way that people age in this country. And when you criticize him on those merits, people think, well, he looks just like my great grandpa or my grandpa. And at the very best, those people don't vote. And at the very worst, they vote for Biden if you're a Republican or an independent. But going back to the polling component of it, it's manipulation, isn't it? The numbers, in my mind, and you lost me in 2016 with respect to polling. You totally lost Carlos Saldivia. But today in 2020, they're using it as a spear to basically set expectations in the Republican minds as to where we really are in the state of what people think. And it's a very good tool to sit there and say, hey, in spite of everything that's happened in the last 4 years, Joe Biden is up by 11 points in Pennsylvania. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. And, I think just about everybody at this point ought to be looking back to 2016 when Hillary had a 99% chance of winning. I mean, that's going to be hard to forget, right? But I think it's kind of a mixture. It's a mixture in that, yes, the media does want to make it look like Biden's way ahead, even when he's not, and it would be absurd to think that he was. Okay, there's that. But there's also the fact, and this is often forgotten, that people are afraid to be honest with pollsters about supporting someone who is conservative, but especially someone who is like Trump. Someone who historically has spoken his mind and someone who the media so obviously hates. That means that people who fear things like, collective outrage, who fear things like losing their job and so on, these people who happen to be everyday Americans, when they're asked by some strange pollster who you're going to vote for this year, they might just be tempted to say, well, Joe Biden, of course, regardless of who they're actually going to vote for. And that's sad, because we shouldn't have a state in America where people are afraid to say, I support President Donald Trump,
Exactly.
out of fear of some kind of repercussion down the line.
They call that the shy vote, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's happened before, but I think the media makes it worse because they're constantly piling on Trump, and they have been for, his entire presidency, but also even before that, right? He was the big bad guy who was, willing to say what he really thought in the election. And so I think that's one of the reasons that they were so wrong then. It wasn't just that they so badly wanted Hillary to win. It was that they really thought that she would, because everyone wanted to tell them, yeah, of course, I'm voting for Hillary. I'm totally with her, because people feared the what people would think of them, because all they hear is, if you're a Trump supporter, you're a bad person. Moreover, you're a deplorable. And who wants to be that deplorable, right? And so when you're asked about it for somebody you don't really know, I mean, it may be different for your neighbor or the guy that, you go fishing with or whatever. But for some stranger, you're probably going to try and keep it to yourself.
Now, before we get to Todd, I want to just follow up your thoughts on the fact that the idea of attacking Joe Biden on his mental state, it's a bad idea, correct?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, I don't want to attack anybody on the grounds of their mental state. I will say that I think the people advising him ought to be saying, it's time to retire, and that's the way that I feel. I don't get any pleasure out of the fact that Joe seems to be struggling. I think it's frankly sad, and at times it seems cold. Just really, really cold to put him on stage. Like, for example, right, I saw one case where he was talking to the camera and, giving one of his speeches, and then in the middle of it, he turns around and looks at the screen behind him and continues his speech as if he's confused. I thought it was tragic. I mean, no, I'm not going to criticize him over that. I don't think anybody should. I mean, I do think it shows that he shouldn't be president of the United States. But it's not something to used as some kind of stick, but the people who are putting him in that position, they ought to be ashamed of themselves.
Right. It's not a political argument. It's just not. I'm sorry. I love this country, Sarah. It's not a political argument. It's completely out of bounds. I'm a conservative. Everyone knows where I stand. You cannot attack Joe on these things. I mean, hey, listen, we all make jokes, political jokes. We all appreciate political jokes, especially the ones on the left. Some of them are very, very funny. That's different than being and having and posting specious content. But everyone should understand that that's out of bounds. To you, Todd, with respect to the media manipulation on the polling.
Well, Carlos, to your point about Joe Biden, I mean, look on the bright side of a Joe Biden presidency. Every year at the Easter egg hunt, he can hide his own Easter eggs.
See, now that's a good one.
You have to understand, right? I'm there with my grandmother in her last days. She was phenomenal to me my whole life, and her mind was not what it was in her younger years. And, she's spelling out, trying to spell out different things. She did crosswords for a long time, and she's calling out these letters. And, I'm sitting there going, I hear you. We know exactly what you mean. We totally get it. And I'm not knocking the fact that the guy has obvious deficit. And I'm with, I'm with you guys on the whole idea of this is shameful. This is shameful for the party that's putting him forward, knowing the deficit. And isn't it going to be ironic, before I get to the media point, isn't it going to be ironic that if he is elected president, those very same people that called out the current president for being unfit for office and trying to use the 25th Amendment may well use the 25th Amendment to remove a sitting president because he's got a deficit. Okay, so to the media point of manipulating the polls, if they're not willing to show you who he really is as a candidate, you're really going to believe the polls? And to our guest's point, right? This was the same media that was lined up at the Javits Center that didn't tell anybody that the campaign the days before had canceled the fireworks. Why had they canceled the fireworks? What did they know? Because their internal polling told them she was going to lose. I defer back my time.
No, I agree. Let me say real quick about this polling situation. I agree with everything.
Want to talk about the Easter eggs?
I guess not. But I think you summed it up quite well. Now, on the polling situation, of course, we can't trust them. Like you're saying there, Todd, they lie all the time. But I think that there's an additional lie going on here, or at least an additional reason for it. I think that we could all see that we've had a media that have done the following things. They're supporting riots or deflecting for them, and this includes the Democratic Party. But I repeat myself, the media is the Democratic Party. So they're supporting riots. They're supporting a Marxist movement trying to overthrow this country. They're supporting governors that intentionally put the most vulnerable people to COVID in nursing homes that were COVID positive, thereby creating death camps and tens of thousands of people dying. The media also knew that hydrochloroquine had a potential to be successful, and now we know that the best study shows it could have saved half of the people that died, but they would have rather seen those people die because they didn't want to give Trump a victory. That same media, that same Democratic Party is not going to be above and beyond cheating when it comes to mail-in ballot fraud or voter fraud or whatever when it comes to the election. To me, the polling, and it's showing that Biden is so far ahead, it's setting the stage so when they cheat to try to win the election, they'll be able to say, oh, this fits right in with our polling. Whereas if the polls were showing Trump's 10 to 15 points up and all of a sudden he miraculously loses the day of the election, they know that people would say, wait a minute, what's going on? How is that possible? So I think that the polling is part of them laying the groundwork where they could now say, okay, if we had the polls saying for 8 months beforehand, Trump doesn't have a chance, then when we steal the election, no one will bat an eye and say, well, that matched what the polling said for 8 months. And so I was just curious what your thoughts were on that potentially, Sarah.
Well, it seems pretty likely. I think that's exactly the same thing they were trying to try last time, though. And yeah, there are a lot of parallels between now and 2016. Like, for example, the last time I heard of Black Lives Matter riots were in 2016, interestingly enough. They just seem to materialize around election time. It seems quite interesting. But I will agree. I mean, it is about manipulation of various sorts, and it doesn't seem beyond the pale that the media would be trying to prepare for mass election fraud. And since we have the mail-in ballots being encouraged now under the guise of fighting this virus, well, yeah, I would expect a lot of election fraud to take place. And, so few conservative leaders are really speaking up and saying, hold on a minute, our elections actually matter. Let's have some integrity in our elections. I'm like, where are our elected leaders on this from the conservative side?
And if I could just say real quick on the Joe Biden point, to me, it seems obvious that what this says is, like, take for a moment what side you're on. Are you a Trump supporter or a Biden supporter? Just think of what Biden says about our system. I think our system is so incredibly messed up at this point, in large part because all of these institutions, such as the media, and them being no longer journalists, but just pundits that are propagandists, basically. Your best candidate is an empty suit. Is an empty vessel, because the election isn't between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The election's between the media and all of these institutions versus Donald Trump. Or more accurately, all of these institutions versus the American people. That's what the election's about. So they don't want someone who might have their own thoughts and opinions. They want someone who is totally malleable, and they want to keep him from debating, and they want to keep him from the public sphere, because to them, the debate is only about one thing, and that is crushing Donald Trump. And so I think that I was just curious what your thoughts are, Sarah. I think that says a lot about our system and how corrupt things have become, where you could literally have someone who's basically a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and they have a solid chance of winning the presidency now because it doesn't even matter who the president is. They're going to be controlled by all these propagandists behind them.
Well, a lot of people have said something in the past about how a president is essentially just a puppet, right? Controlled behind the scenes by various different people, people of greater power secretly, essentially. And it's interesting that now, as they push Joe Biden forward, it's like that they're doing that in a very transparent way. Like, here's our puppet, and we'll work it behind the scenes and, get our agenda through. That's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, by the way, Robert, in 2020, your analysis of who this campaign, Trump versus every single other Democratic apparatus, that is the single greatest idea that I've heard in 2020. That is absolutely amazing analysis. It's the best idea that I've heard in 2020. But going back to what Sarah said, and this is my final question, and it doesn't mean you have to go, Sarah. It is funny that you said that this organization springs up again in 2020, because the last time you heard about it was their tactics in 2016. What is
it? Worked so well the last time.
What is it about these things that keep popping up? What is it about Little League's embracing of this organization, and now Sports Illustrated putting a transgender person on their cover? What is it about the fact that these people are so woke, yet only now are they doing the things that their wokeness has been telegraphing for years? Why is it today that we have the first transgendered swimsuit cover model? Why did it take Little League so long to finally discover that there's systemic racism in Little League? And why did it take the Williamsport Area School District so long to discover that there is systemic racism in the district? Why is it now that these things are being reconciled when they should have been reconciled, according to their wokeness, years ago? And why is that our fault?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that Democrat funding is, well, around. And that's part of the problem, of course, is that you have essentially the Democratic Party and Democrat funders who are funding large corporations. They get them to make these, as you called it, woke decisions. But also, it's not just that, because you have all these different companies who are all of a sudden engaging in their own kind of self-shaming, at the same time shaming us. Well, because you have is this society that the collective shaming is so great that they're like, well, every other company is doing it. And also, they're listening too much to places like Twitter, places that people go and spend all day because they don't have jobs, which makes it essentially full of college students. But really, you have these companies who are listening to what's going on there and aren't listening to mainstream America, because mainstream America largely doesn't have a voice. And so, like, well, all of our people are against us. Look at all of our customers who suddenly hate us and hate our inner bigotry. We're going to have to come out with a statement about this, because it looks like all of our customers throughout the country are mad at us. And that's not the case. Instead, what you have is leftist groups who have really honed this into a science, this act of collectively calling and harassing a company to try and get them to essentially take a knee. And it works. It works a lot when, for example, like Tucker Carlson says something that, you know, the left doesn't like. And suddenly, some group at a far left organization like Sleeping Giants, which is one of the more notorious ones, gets a group of people together and says, okay, you need to go ahead and call this advertiser of Tucker Carlson and harass and make it sound like you're their biggest customer and have been for years, and now you're not going to do business with them anymore. And suddenly you have, you know, insurance companies and everything else saying, okay, we don't want to be associated with Tucker Carlson anymore. That's what happens, even though Tucker Carlson is the most watched news anchor in America.
Right. And as a real quick follow-up, because I know that Todd and Rob have questions. Is it plausible? I'm not saying this happened. Is it plausible that ESPN, who's owned by Capital Cities ABC, who's owned by Disney, at the heels of what happened 10 days ago with the NFL taking a knee, went to all their broadcast partners, like Little League? They have a 10-year, $80 million contract with Little League. And this was the conversation, Sarah. Take a knee or else. No?
Yeah, it seems entirely plausible to me. I mean, and, you know, money talks, I guess they say. But again, it's time that people, whoever they are, start standing up for, I mean, common decency is all I'm asking for. Stand up for, like, fundamental honesty. American values. Honesty, exactly.
Just honesty.
Yeah.
It's not difficult. We're not asking for a lot. Todd, questions for Sarah?
Well, and Sarah, we're going to talk about this Myrtle Beach thing here over the next hour. I mean, do you have time to stay with us? Because it would be such a great learning process for our audience if you stayed for a little bit longer. Is that an option for you to stay a little bit longer as we start to break down this Myrtle Beach? Because as you begin to hear this story in real time, and if we can get your reactions to some of this, is that an option for you to stay for a little bit longer? Yeah,
I'd love to.
Okay, so that's awesome. Okay, so that said, and again, thank you, Rob. That said, to Carlos's point, that they went to the broadcast partners, Adrian Wojnarowski sent a senator a 2-word response about being called out over this entire woke culture in the NBA. I mean, if you want Exhibit A, there it is.
Yeah.
Right? And then ESPN had to walk Woj's response back and say that was inappropriate.
And Woj is one of the most respected journalists in the NBA, if not the most respected journalist. Is that correct, Tom?
He's the Adam Schefter of the NBA.
Yep.
He is I don't know what kind of name I could give him to accurately put him in the heights of where he is within the NBA, and how many people, Sarah, trust this guy? is unbelievable in that culture, in that basketball culture.
Well, so real quick, and then we can move on to the Myrtle Beach stuff. But just to finish this up, two things I wanted to say and ask Sarah about. The first is the timing that you correctly bring up, that, it's an election year, so Black Lives Matter's back. Notice, by the way, in 2015, they didn't institute any structural changes. Things are worse today than when Black Lives Matter originally formed. So I'm sure there'll be hope for the inner city community. Spoiler alert, the exact things that Black Lives Matter's pushing, such as the disillusionment of the nuclear family, will make things worse for all Americans, including inner city Black Americans. So Black Lives Matter is completely anathema to the solutions to problems in these inner cities. But I just wanted to get a quick comment on you about this, Sarah. When we're talking about the timing, it doesn't even make sense if you take it outside the context of the election. So, for example, I'm sure you know this, when I've been debating people on Black Lives Matter, they have to default. They know that they can't just say it's over cops shooting, because there was only, 9 unarmed blacks that were shot last year by police. So they have to pivot and say, no, it's about speeding tickets and jaywalking, and law enforcement is just against black people in general in this country. But how does that add up? Why we need hundreds of thousands on the people in the street now, when the exact same people are telling us, and by the way, if you go outside and go to your job, you're going to get COVID. So why couldn't we wait for the message of Black Lives Matter until COVID goes away? I mean, to me, it shows that they're being disingenuous with both of these stances, that it's just a full court press to try to destroy this country and to destroy any chances that Trump has of getting reelected. Elsewise, couldn't you protest about racial injustice, like from the safety of your home until COVID gets passed?
One would think so. It does seem pretty interesting, but it's like suddenly they're admitting that the entire, focus, the very foundation of their riots and so-called movement was flawed, or, it simply didn't match reality. It's like they're admitting that now, and yet now suddenly they care about everything. They care about all the Democrat causes. They care about basically the Green New Deal, right? They want all of it. And and to your point earlier that you made in the beginning of that, well, communists always want to split up the family unit. That's been one of their kind of foundational thesis, and to separate kids. And it's interesting now, you've got all these different articles from major news organizations about just how harmful homeschooling is, because the kids are at home being taught by their parents. It's like, well, that's the worst thing ever. And maybe we should just ban and make it illegal to homeschool. So, a lot of different major news organizations posit that idea that we should ban homeschooling in order to, keep kids away from their parents and away from essentially the moral fabric. It's like, I'm not really sure how, I don't know where to go with that. It's just like,
yep. No, I agree.
It's so,
they need that indoctrination. I mean, this is something that I say all the time. The worse your ideas are, the more censorious and indoctrinating you need to be. So we're willing to have discussions with anyone. Why? It's not because we're the smartest people in the world. We're up there, but no. It's because we have good ideas. And so we're willing to discuss those with people. We don't need to censor people. But when you have these...
We're transparent.
That's right. When you're a Marxist and your ideas are horrific, and history has bared that out over and over, you have to indoctrinate. You have to censor. Because otherwise, if people know the truth, there's no way they would accept your movement. And so just pivoting a little, and maybe then, Todd, you could explain an overview of the Myrtle Beach story. But this, I think, might be a lead into it for you, Sarah. We keep hearing about institutional and systemic racism. But my question is, the people that are speaking on it the loudest have been in control of these institutions for years. So, for example, we see in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, that city's been ran by Democrats for 60 years, that for 60 years have been talking about systemic racism. We see in Williamsport, for example, in the school district, where they released a statement saying, yes, systemic racism in Williamsport. Well, then point to the people that are controlling these systems. Why is it that all of these people, including Black Lives Matter, including all of these politicians and administrators, they keep preaching about systemic racism? Well, point me to the person. Where are the people that have engaged in this racism? Oh, wait, you've been in charge for 20 years? You and your party have been in charge, or your cohorts have been in charge? So it just seems to me, even Black Lives Matter, if it was really about systemic racism, wouldn't they be going after the people that controlled the systems instead of going after middle America and burning down inner city black communities?
Yeah, it seems pretty interesting, doesn't it? That the areas where these riots have really taken off are places like Seattle and Portland and Atlanta. And it's like, these places have been, ran by Democrats for quite a while. Maybe Democrats are the problem, just maybe. It would certainly seem so. But I would, to be frank with you, take issue with the very underlying idea that America has essential systemic racism. I mean, I'm pretty sure you agree with me here. I'm not saying otherwise, but I just can't kind of let that go as if it's something that does exist in America, because it doesn't. To the contrary, I would say that, because when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about systemic racism against people who aren't white. That's inferred.
Right.
And that's not the case. That's not the case in America. It's not the case in our educational institutions. In fact, you could argue the opposite is true. There is active discrimination against whites and Asians. And also in our area of employment.
Don't forget Latinos. Don't forget Latinos.
Right. And also in the area of employment, right, you have specific privileges for employers who hire enough non-white or minority groups. I mean, and you're talking about systemic racism in this country. It's like, are you kidding? If anything, the active racism that we have in America institutionally and at government levels for grants and so on is actually anti-white.
Right. And I just think that it's ironic that the people, this would be like Hollywood coming out and saying, man, there's a massive problem with sexual assaults in Hollywood. Right, that's you guys. Then fix it. If you're in charge of these institutions and all you do is shout about institutional racism, but you and your cohorts have been in charge of it. So I agree with you. It doesn't exist, at least not in the way they're saying. But to me, it's just ironic. When I hear all of these leaders shouting about systemic racism and institutional racism, they might as well be saying, yes, I'm systemically racist. I've controlled the system and I've allowed it to be racist for 20, 30 years. Why would we listen to the very people that are admitting, yes, we've been in control of the system and it's been horribly racist, but now vote for us and we'll solve the racism? I mean, it's garbage.
Right, and if I could just jump in for a second here, I want to say it seems interesting that whilst they're talking about how bad racism is, they want people to associate by their race. It's people on the conservative side that says, don't judge people by their race, judge people as individuals. Yep. We have individual rights, we're individual people, and just because you're of a certain race or you're of a certain gender doesn't mean that you represent that entire group. You can be an autonomous individual with your own ideas. You have your own value. And I think that's the most kind of anti-racist idea. Yep. On the left, you've got those saying, no, you are your group. Don't stand out. Don't be different. Whenever you're speaking, you are a representative of that race. And it's like, they're the ones complaining about racism whilst also trying to get us to see people solely by their race.
Well, and if I may chime in real quick on that point, I am not only an immigrant, I'm a Latino immigrant. So would it be fair, and this is where I go, immediately where I go, if you look at, if your first lens in looking at anything is through the lens of race, I'm sorry, Sarah, you're a racist. I'm sorry, because that's what it is. And the rest of us don't do that. That's why we're shocked when Rob says that there's racism in Hollywood. What are you talking about?
Right.
You guys control it. But if you could comment real quick, and then I'll lead Todd into the Myrtle Beach thing. Sarah.
Yep, I completely agree. And it's like they're trying to, and they being the collective left, are trying to change the way we all speak and think about one another.
Right.
Like you look at our there was this graphic that's being posted around because somebody at the U.S. military recently sent it out as if it was from the U.S. military. But in it had all the different things that essentially the left considers to be really racist and offensive. Mm-hmm. And one of those things was that you should be race blind. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yep. Really?
That to look at a person and not see race, to just see them as an individual, is considered by the left now to be racist. This was held as the highest ideal, to look past these immutable characteristics that none of us can control. We're simply born how we are, and and look at the person by their value set or by their accomplishments, by their merits. And instead, that is now considered by the left to be something that's immoral. And that's why I say that we need more conservatives speaking up about the moral issues, because these people aren't moral. And it needs to be pointed out that they're clearly not. They want everybody to identify with their race. They want to look at a person and think that they know everything about them on the basis of that alone, on the basis of what they can think. Oh, look, you're black and you're male. You must be a Democrat and you better vote with us.